Greetings, everyone. The world is reeling from an unprecedented full-scale siege in modern history. The Kremlin is being pushed into a suffocating situation where military and economic pincers are tightening from all directions. Can the northern giant turn the tide when Western rivals have already approached the red line? This video will provide an in-depth and comprehensive analysis of the brutal strategic shifts taking place in Eastern Europe and the Baltic region. And here are the key points you can't miss. A harsh ultimatum from the White House. Donald Trump officially returns and activates Phase 2 of the sanctions. The sudden blow directly targets Russia's oil lifeline with the aim of strangling the economy, forcing Moscow to bow at the negotiating table. The blockade is right at the doorstep of St. Petersburg, unveiling NATO's new army base in Helpless, Finland, just 140 kilometers from the Russian border. This is the final blow to 75.5 years of historic neutrality, doubling the length of the shared border between Russia and NATO overnight. A military warning on the Baltic Sea, the massive Quadriga 2025 exercise with 49 warships maneuvering close to the opponent's border, ready to respond to the Zapad 2025 exercise of the Russian-Belarusian coalition. A chilling warning about a full-scale clash before 2029 from German military leaders. Estonia is quickly building nuclear bunkers and preparing for a preemptive strike on the Kremlin. After depleting its resources in the prolonged war in Ukraine, is the Kremlin using information warfare to incite pro-Russian fifth column forces to recreate the tragedy of the occupation in Crimea and Donbass in 2014, right in the heart of Tallinn? Estonia is responding strongly by raising its defense spending to a record 5.4% of GDP. Estonia is urgently fortifying its border areas, and citizens are building their own nuclear shelters. Northern prosperity and freedom will be the fortress that thwarts Russia's ambitions. Up next is the content and a detailed analysis. Putin is powerless as NATO's super base approaches, threatening to activate secondary sanctions. Ladies and gentlemen, the Kremlin is being pressured from all sides by groundbreaking decisions. The clearest evidence of this tense situation is that the Western military alliance has decided to establish a strategic outpost right at Russia's doorstep. When NATO's Supreme Command of the regional land forces officially began operations in the city of Helpless, Finland. Located in a highly strategic position, Helpless is only 140 kilometers from the Russian border and just over 300 kilometers from St. Petersburg. This is a move with tremendous deterrent power. Previously, the closest NATO base to the Russian border was in Szczecin, Poland, which is 400 kilometers from the outskirts of Kaliningrad. Now this new strategic command center operates under direct U.S. comm and will be responsible for coordinating the Nordic national land forces, integrating Finnish and NATO units to prepare for rapid response scenarios against any risk of conflict. For President Vladimir Putin, who has always considered NATO's eastward expansion a vital threat, this is a harsh reality. The Kremlin once used this reason to justify its full-scale military campaign in Ukraine in 2022. But that very action created a cruel backlash, pushing Finland, a country with a 1,340-kilometer border with Russia, to abandon its historic neutrality and embrace the alliance to defend itself against Moscow's ambitions to restore Soviet-era influence. Finland's Minister of Defense affirmed that the establishment of the Helpless base, starting with a core team of 10 experts and set to continuously expand, is a strong declaration that the country has fully integrated into NATO's collective defense system. However, with this strategic pincer in the north, another military storm is also brewing over the icy Baltic Sea, where NATO has decided to deliver a strong response to the large-scale Zapad 2025 exercises conducted by the Russia-Belarus alliance. Under the leadership of Germany, Phase 3 of the large-scale exercise, codenamed Quadriga 2025, with the operation called Northern Coast, is turning port cities and open sea areas into solid defensive fortresses. These are no longer just hypothetical scenarios on paper. Nearly 2,000 soldiers and 40 modern warships from 14 member countries are now deployed, closing in on the opponent's border. They practice everything from establishing rapid supply corridors to quickly providing naval units with fuel, ammunition, drinking water, and food, to conducting emergency medical drills right on board the ships under conditions of sabotage warfare. In the Baltic sky, German soldiers are intensely carrying out exercises to shoot down enemy drones approaching from the sea. Russian defense media channels are boiling with anger at the sight of armored convoys and equipment from the alliance moving closer to the border. Meanwhile, the alliance has pledged to strictly protect the eastern flank, where the front line borders Russia. After an on-site inspection in Ukraine, the German Army Inspector General issued a chilling warning to all allies that the Kremlin is aggressively amassing enormous military power and could launch a direct attack on NATO countries before 2029. However, German military leaders believe that Russia is unlikely to risk starting a war during the exercise that will take place from mid-August to the end of September. But NATO's message is extremely tough and resolute. They are ready to defend every centimeter of their territory, whether on land, at sea, or in the air. But Moscow's greatest tragedy does not stop at Western guns and warships. It comes from another devastating blow on the economic front, where the West never acts alone. When pressure mounted from all sides, President Donald Trump lost his patience and officially issued a harsh ultimatum, declaring his readiness to move to phase 2 of harsh sanctions against Russia. Standing before reporters at the White House, when asked whether Washington was prepared to impose the strictest sanctions to tighten the grip on the Kremlin and punish the Russian leader, he responded, because the U.S. president answered coldly and decisively that he was ready. This will be a blow that the Kremlin will have to remember for a very long time. Echoing the president, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent emphasized that Washington has prepared for every scenario to maximize pressure while also waiting for coordinated actions from European partners. This time, the weapon of mass destruction in their hands is the system of secondary sanctions and strict tariffs targeting any country that dares to continue buying Russian oil. This strategy is ruthlessly calculated to push the entire Russian economy into total collapse, choke off funding for the war machine, and leave Vladimir Putin with no choice but to bow his head and come to the negotiating table. From suffocating military pressure at the border to crippling economic sanctions, Russia is facing an unprecedented, comprehensive siege in modern history. Look at the strategic chessboard of Eastern Europe, where a tragic historical paradox is unfolding. The decision to launch the war in Ukraine has entered its 4th year. With so much bloodshed and destruction of homes, the actions of the Kremlin leader to prevent NATO's expansion have ultimately led to a completely opposite outcome. The Western military alliance did not back down. On the contrary, it quietly advanced straight to the borders of the Russian Federation without any need for permission. Finland and Sweden abandoning their 75-year-long neutral stance to join the NATO alliance is strong evidence that the West has fully exploited Moscow's miscalculations in the post-Soviet space. It was Finnish Defense Minister Antti Hakkinen who approved the military deployment in August 2025 and emphasized that establishing a headquarters in Mikkeli is a message to the Kremlin that could not be clearer. Finland is now an inseparable part of NATO, and the alliance will be the ultimate shield protecting their sovereignty. The establishment of the Army headquarters in Mikkeli is a calculated strategic counterattack by NATO in response to Russia's continuous construction of new military bases near the Finnish border, including Kandalaksa, Techo-Gievo, and a series of other military zones within the Russian Federation. Although in the initial phase, this center operates with only about 10 key personnel, plans to expand its scale 5-fold in the future show the alliance's long-term preparation for a scenario of escalating tensions right at Russia's doorstep. Faced with increasingly tight encirclement, the Kremlin is responding with extremely drastic countermeasures both on land and at sea. Continuous provocative actions serve as warning bells for a potential direct conflict, from Russian warships illegally entering Estonian territorial waters to the Russian Ministry of Defense's controversial sovereignty claims over Sweden's Gotland Island in the Baltic Sea, and even to sophisticated sabotage campaigns by jamming GPS signals on a large scale. The climax was an incident that directly affected the plane carrying European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. These actions, combined with reconnaissance flights by Russian drones appearing in the skies, reflect a coordinated campaign orchestrated by Russian special agencies aimed at destabilizing the region. The magazine International Affairs, published by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has openly called the Baltic Sea a possible site for future military operations. In that context, new orders from the figure hiding behind the iron bars of the Kremlin have been passed down to Russian scholars in the state media apparatus, revealing the next target in their ideological expansion ambitions. Moscow seems to have chosen a new target for a potential future military intervention, and the name mentioned is Estonia, a member of NATO. Although on television, Russian propagandists always mock and dismiss this scenario because Estonia is 300 times smaller than Russia, the flow of Russian public opinion is quietly being steered toward a new confrontation, exactly as ordered from above. Facing imminent danger, the Estonian government quickly banned travel to Russia and began mentally preparing for a life-or-death struggle. An analysis published in Poland's Onet magazine even pointed out that Estonia is ready to launch a preemptive strike if it perceives a risk of invasion. This is not an act of provocation, but rather a desperate yet extremely resilient resistance by a small nation facing the specter of Putin's war. Estonia is channeling all its resources into national defense as it plans to increase military spending to 5.4% of GDP over the next 4 years. Along more than 300 kilometers of border, sturdy fences are being erected and emergency minefields are being set up to stop the armored convoys of occupying forces in the event of a full-scale invasion. It's not just the military. Even ordinary citizens are preparing for the worst-case scenario. They are building personal nuclear shelters deep underground and actively joining civil defense alliances to prepare for a possible devastating war. The relentless cyber attacks and mysterious satellite jamming from Russia have not made them surrender. Instead, it has only strengthened their resolve to turn every inch of borderland into a solid fortress, ready to strike back against any foreign invader. Amidst the storm of war unleashed by the Kremlin, which is sweeping through and trampling on all commitments and international laws, the Baltic states are facing a harsh reality of survival. For Estonia, a resilient member of both NATO and the European Union, the challenge of protecting national sovereignty has never been more critical. This tragic awakening has become even more apparent, especially after President Donald Trump once again set foot in the White House. Under their leadership, the people have come to a profound realization of a harsh truth. They cannot entrust their fate to anyone else, but must stand firmly on their own feet to face the threat of invasion from the giant in the north. All resources and the highest efforts are being concentrated by this small nation into a whole-of-society defense posture, preparing for the worst-case scenario if war breaks out. However, the lens of geopolitical analysis reveals a surprisingly contrasting picture, going against the ambitious calculations of the great power. The successive humiliating defeats of the Russian army on the Ukrainian battlefield, combined with the rapid construction of rock-solid defensive lines by Estonia, have drained President Vladimir Putin's resources. The Kremlin at this point is completely powerless, no longer having enough strong troops, capable commanders, or equipment to open a true second front. It is this strategic deadlock that has forced Russia to shift to an equally sinister scenario, a brutal information war, targeting the Russian-speaking communities living in Baltic countries in order to sow division within the enemy from the inside. This psychological warfare is exposing a painful social divide right in the heart of Estonia. Society here is being split into two distinct extremes. Most resilient citizens are prepared to sacrifice for the country and back all government defense policies. On the opposite side, a significant portion of traitors, those known as vatniks, or the so-called fifth column of Putin, are constantly undermining the nation's foundations day and night. They despise everything from the language and culture to the free lifestyle of Estonia. They are just waiting for the heavy boots of the Russian army to march in, hoping to be liberated and to ignite chaos. Taking advantage of this undercurrent, the Kremlin is planning a risky gamble by targeting Estonia, a country with a population of less than 1.4 million people. Military experts are concerned that, with the support of local pro-Russian forces, elite covert commando groups, those little green men without insignia, like the ghosts of 2014, could repeat the tragedy of the occupation of Crimea and the Donbass right in the heart of Tallinn. That haunting scenario begins with a rapid seizure of key infrastructure, such as post offices, telecommunication stations, ATMs, and even convenience stores, in order to paralyze the government apparatus before declaring the establishment of a puppet autonomous entity and welcoming Russian tanks to legitimize the annexation. This is exactly the same mistake that happened in Donetsk and Luhansk in the past, where a radical minority took advantage of the government's hesitation to set up barricades, seize weapons depots, and create an unstoppable domino effect of collapse. On Russian national television, the Kremlin's propaganda apparatus is aggressively promoting arrogant scenarios, claiming that Estonia would collapse within just a few days, and that Russian armored convoys would approach major European cities before NATO could respond in any way. But those unrealistic fantasies will surely be shattered against a solid fortress called prosperity and freedom. Analysts say Russia will pay a high price if it intentionally tries to take over Estonia, because no matter how strong the pro-Russian sentiment is, Putin's supporters in the Baltics are still enjoying a life of comfort in modern, fully equipped apartments with superior social welfare systems and good salaries by European standards. Estonia currently ranks 10th in the world for quality of life, 6th for economic freedom, and 12th for the Corruption Perception Index, a huge gap compared to Russia's 121st position. This is a country with the top public education system in Europe, ranked 4th in the world, and is also the cradle of the continent's most dynamic tech startups. No one would be crazy enough to give up that freedom and prosperity to return to a Russia mired in corruption, unemployment, and authoritarian rule. So, in your opinion, could a scenario of hybrid warfare and the incitement of underground forces help Russia gain the upper hand in Estonia the way they did with Crimea in 2014?